Senator Adam Schiff kept shuffling his papers like the next page might rescue him, but the room had already decided the rhythm, and it wasn't his. Tulsi Gabbard sat at the witness table with the kind of stillness you only see in people who've been trained to stay calm while everyone else is performing. The hearing was supposed to be about whether President Donald Trump's nominee for Director of National Intelligence had the temperament, judgment, and independence to oversee 18 agencies. Instead, Schiff suddenly looked like the one being evaluated, not because anyone declared a trial, but because the tone shifted into something sharper. Credibility math. And once a hearing turns into credibility math, the person with the cleanest receipts, real or perceived, starts driving the conversation. Gabbard didn't raise her voice, and that was the point. She didn't need theatrics, because the contrast was already doing the work. The veteran with a stack of transcripts versus the senator with a stack of talking points. Schiff tried to run his standard script, questions about concerning statements, hints about foreign sympathies, the familiar posture of a watchdog who assumes the audience trusts his instincts. But Gabbard cut in with a single move that, in Washington, is always either brave or reckless, depending on which side you're on. She flipped the spotlight. Before you quiz me about judgment, she essentially said, let's talk about yours, because your public certainty over the years doesn't line up neatly with how the official record reads to a lot of Americans. She didn't claim to be a mind reader. She framed it as an accountability question, the kind that lands hardest when it's asked slowly and answered poorly. For years, Schiff went on CNN and MSNBC and other networks and told viewers he had seen direct evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. Not just suspicion, not just smoke, but something sturdier. Gabbard's strategy wasn't to relitigate every headline. It was to pin down what direct evidence was supposed to mean, and whether the meaning ever matched what investigators ultimately concluded. And she did it the way prosecutors and auditors do it. Date, network, quote, then pause long enough for the silence to become the question. On the screens, clips played of Schiff using confident language in 2017 and 2018, phrases that sounded definitive in the moment. Gabbard didn't have to editorialize much. The certainty in those clips was already familiar to anyone who lived through that news cycle. Then she contrasted that certainty with the most blunt line in the public summary of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's findings. The investigation did not establish a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. That's where people start talking past each other, because Schiff's defenders will argue collusion isn't a legal term, while his critics will say the point wasn't the statute book, it was the promise he made to the public. Gabbard leaned into that gap and asked the question that's devastating precisely because it sounds simple. When you told Americans you had direct evidence, what were you referring to specifically? Schiff tried to widen the frame. Contacts, meetings, the totality, the kind of language that lets you move without admitting you moved. Gabbard kept narrowing it back down, not to trap him into a confession, but to highlight the difference between insinuation and proof. She referenced committee testimony, declassified excerpts, the fact that multiple intelligence officials over the years described the picture as complicated, but not the cinematic smoking gun the public was told to expect. Whether every document she cited would hold up under the harshest cross-checking is almost beside the point in a political hearing, because the emotional logic was crystal clear. If you spent years sounding certain, she implied, why does the certainty look softer when it's pinned to paper? Then she pivoted to the Carter-Page FISA process. And this is where Washington's vocabulary becomes a maze for normal people. Most viewers don't live inside the footnotes of Inspector General reports, but they do understand the basic idea. If the government is going to surveil someone connected to a presidential campaign, the paperwork better be spotless. Gabbard pointed to the Inspector General Michael Horowitz report and the errors and omissions language that became its own kind of political grenade. Schiff, for his part, went for the refuge most elected officials choose in this situation: procedural defenses, context, good faith intentions, and the claim that the other side is overselling the problem. Gabbard treated that like a dodge, and she pressed the same theme again. If the report described serious mistakes, why did you publicly sound so confident the process was sound? The hearing, at least in this dramatized version of events, runs on a particular kind of tension. The difference between what can be proven in court and what can be implied on television. Gabbard didn't have to accuse Schiff of a crime to make the audience feel the ethical discomfort. She used questions, contradictions, and timelines, letting the viewer's imagination supply the outrage without her having to state it as a verdict. That approach is more effective than a direct accusation anyway, because direct accusations invite viewers to pick teams and stop thinking. A well-placed contradiction keeps people thinking, and thinking is where doubt grows. From there, she slid into the subject that haunts every Intelligence Committee member who likes to appear on cable news: leaks. Schiff, like many members of Congress, has always had a close relationship with media, and his critics have long believed that relationship crossed lines that are hard to prove and easy to suspect. Gabbard's move was to say not "you leaked," but "look at the pattern," and she described sequences where briefings, calls, and stories seemed to align in ways that made coincidence feel less believable. If you're Schiff, you argue that correlation is not causation, that reporters cultivate many sources, that committee members can't control what gets printed, and that insinuations are cheap. If you're Gabbard, you argue that repeated coincidence becomes a governance problem, because public trust erodes when classified work looks like it's feeding a media strategy. Then came the 2020 laptop controversy, which is the kind of subject that turns any hearing into a cultural civil war in minutes. Gabbard didn't have to declare the entire media ecosystem corrupt. She just had to highlight how quickly public figures labeled the story Russian disinformation before key facts were clear to the public. She referenced Schiff's on-air statements that treated the story's origin as settled, not speculative, and she framed the question as one about responsibility. If you're a senior intelligence voice and you speak with certainty, do you owe the public extraordinary care before you stamp something as foreign propaganda? Schiff's likely defense is that Russia runs influence operations, that caution is warranted, and that responsible officials warn the public when patterns resemble prior interference. But Gabbard's counter is where the political knife twists. Even if you believe caution is warranted, she implied, how do you explain the absolute tone, the rhetorical confidence, the way "could be" becomes "clearly is"? Is that public service, or is that narrative management? And if the story later looks more complicated, or even partially validated, does that make the earlier certainty look less like vigilance and more like overreach? Gabbard kept it framed as a question of discipline. Intelligence work is supposed to be about probability and humility, not cable news certainty. At that point, Schiff tried to climb back onto familiar ground, the idea that the broader pattern of Russian meddling justifies strong warnings, and that critics weaponize hindsight. Gabbard refused to let the argument float at 30,000 feet. She kept dragging it down to the same street-level standard. When you spoke, what did you know? What did you not know? And why did you sound so sure? It's the kind of questioning that makes every political communicator nervous, because modern politics rewards certainty even when certainty is unearned. And a hearing that punishes certainty is a threat not just to one senator, but to the entire performance culture of Washington. She then brought up the episode where phone records connected to various figures were obtained during impeachment-era investigations, and she framed it as institutional muscle being used in ways that feel personal. You don't have to declare it illegal to make it feel unsettling. You just have to describe how it looks from the outside. A member of Congress gets records. A journalist gets pulled into a swirl. A lawyer becomes a data point. And suddenly, oversight starts to resemble surveillance politics. Schiff's defenders argue these were lawful investigative steps in an impeachment inquiry. His critics argue that lawful isn't the same as healthy, especially when power is concentrated and partisanship is hot. Gabbard didn't need to pick a legal conclusion. She just needed the audience to feel the asymmetry. Power moving down a chain and ordinary targets having no realistic way to push back. Then she went for the moment that, in political storytelling, always lands because it's visual. The impeachment hearings, the televised drama, the way summaries and paraphrases can take on a life of their own. She referenced Schiff's widely criticized, in essence, rendition of the Trump-Zelensky call, and she framed it as a case study in how rhetoric can blur into representation. If you're sympathetic to Schiff, you say he was capturing the thrust and moral meaning of the exchange. If you're sympathetic to Gabbard's critique, you say that when you're talking about removing a president, moral meaning isn't enough, and you don't get to write your own dialogue. Gabbard used it as another example of a pattern. Forceful public storytelling that later requires careful footnotes to defend. By now, the hearing had transformed into something closer to a referendum on a political era than a job interview. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't just defending her nomination. She was presenting herself as an antidote to a style of politics she thinks the intelligence world enabled. Adam Schiff wasn't just questioning a nominee. He was being asked to account for a media persona that millions of people either trusted deeply or detested completely. And because this is Washington, the subtext was unavoidable. This wasn't only about facts. It was about power. Who gets to define reality for the public, and who gets punished when reality refuses to cooperate? In a room like that, truth becomes a brand people rent for a day. And the real contest is which brand feels sturdier under pressure. Gabbard's sharpest move, though, wasn't any single document or clip. It was the way she forced Schiff into a posture he's rarely in on television. The posture of someone who has to answer yes or no questions without a friendly host rescuing him with a new segment. She used the hearing's formality against him, implying that public trust depends on officials matching their certainty to their evidence. Schiff tried to talk about the totality, the pattern, the seriousness, phrases that sound responsible but can also sound like fogs when the question is what exactly. And every time he reached for that fog, the tension rose because the audience could feel the mismatch between a simple question and a complicated answer. To keep it from turning into a caricature, you have to admit a few things that can be true at the same time. Russia did interfere in U.S. elections, and serious people warned about it, and it would have been irresponsible to treat the issue like gossip. The FBI and the intelligence community operate in imperfect conditions, and investigations can uncover troubling behavior even when they don't prove a charged conspiracy. Politicians, including Schiff, can sincerely believe they're serving the public while also benefiting politically from the narrative their warnings create. And nominees, including Gabbard, can use public frustration with an era to advance their own political standing while still raising legitimate questions about accountability. The tension comes from deciding where sincerity ends and opportunism begins, and Washington almost never gives you a clean line. Still, the hearing's emotional climax arrived when Gabbard asked the question she knew would travel as a clip. Not, "Are you guilty?" Not, "Did you commit a crime?" But something more corrosive. because it aims at identity rather than a single act. "Have you ever told the truth?" she asked in substance, and she asked it in the tone of someone who thinks the record speaks louder than any denial. Schiff, trapped between conceding too much and denying too broadly, did what politicians do when the floor is lava. He spoke in abstractions about service, duty, and oaths, and Gabbard turned those abstractions into another contrast, arguing that oaths mean little if the public watches the same people bend language whenever power is on the line. In this kind of narrative, you can almost see how the next hours unfold without needing a script. Clips fly, pundits pick sides, sympathetic outlets contextualize, hostile outlets sharpen, and the average viewer decides based on vibe more than footnotes. Gabbard's supporters call it accountability, a long overdue moment where a Washington operator finally meets someone who won't accept rhetorical fog as an answer. Schiff's supporters call it a stunt, a nominee hijacking a hearing to settle political scores and audition for the new power center. And the truth, as usual, is less cinematic. Politics rewards the person who can make the other person look like they're hiding something, even when the something is just the messy reality of modern investigations. But messiness isn't a satisfying defense when the public has spent years hearing absolute certainty. So the real impact isn't whether Schiff wins the exchange in a formal sense. The impact is whether the audience leaves with a stronger or weaker belief that the intelligence apparatus has been used as a political prop. Gabbard's pitch, implicitly, is that she's the adult who will restore discipline, end drama, and refocus agencies on threats instead of headlines. Schiff's pitch, implicitly, is that oversight is messy but necessary, and that critics are rewriting history to excuse a president who deserved scrutiny. Most Americans don't have time to adjudicate every footnote, so they judge the performance of confidence under pressure. And on that specific metric, Gabbard's calm and Schiff's evasiveness, fair or unfair, creates a storyline people remember. If you want to understand why this scene would feel so explosive to viewers, it's because it combines three American obsessions at once. First, the hunger for consequences, somebody, somewhere, finally getting cornered by their own words. Second, the suspicion that elite institutions protect their own, and that the public only gets fragments, curated and spun. Third, the fantasy that a single outsider can walk into the room, lay out the timeline, and force honesty back into a system built to avoid it. Whether that fantasy holds up in real life is almost irrelevant to its political power. The fantasy works because it speaks to a very real exhaustion, with experts who always seem certain until certainty becomes inconvenient. In the end, what makes this story so sticky isn't that it proves one side right and the other side wrong in a clean way. It's that it weaponizes the gap between how politicians talk on television and how institutions speak in careful, hedged reports. Schiff's language over the years has often sounded like he was narrating a conclusion. The official language often reads like an argument for caution and nuance. Gabbard's attack is basically, you don't get to sell the public certainty and then retreat into nuance when the paperwork shows complications. Schiff's defense is basically, you don't get to pretend nuance proves there was nothing worth investigating, and you don't get to turn hindsight into a moral indictment. And if you're watching as an audience member, not a partisan, the unsettling part is that both arguments can feel plausible at the same time. That's why a hearing like this becomes a cultural event. It doesn't settle the era, it reopens it. It turns old footage into new ammunition, and it turns committee procedure into theater that looks like accountability, even when it's really a battle for narrative ownership. Gabbard walks out, looking like someone who demanded answers. Schiff is left looking like someone who can't give them without rewriting his own past. And the public, once again, is left with the same uneasy question that sits under every modern scandal cycle. If everyone insists they were acting in good faith, why does the story always end with the same people gaining power and the same institutions losing trust? The chairman's gavel didn't really restore order so much as it reminded everyone where they were supposed to pretend the limits still existed. Tulsi Gabbard didn't smile on her way back to her seat, and Schiff didn't laugh it off, because there are some moments in Washington you can't diffuse with a clever aside. You could see the staffers on both sides doing the same thing at once, scribbling notes, texting comms teams, and quietly recalculating what tonight's headlines were going to look like. Schiff's allies weren't thinking about the nominee anymore, they were thinking about triage. How to frame this as a stunt without making it look like they're allergic to accountability. Gabbard's supporters weren't thinking about policy either. They were thinking about the clip economy, the one question that would become a slogan by lunchtime. Schiff tried to regain footing with the oldest move in the book: reassert the institution. He leaned into language about process, about the seriousness of the committee, about the danger of turning national security into a reality show. It was a smart pivot in theory, because it sounds adult, and adults usually win on paper. But it landed with a thud, because everyone in that room knew the committee had been televised into a brand long before Tulsi Gabbard ever walked in. You don't get to spend years feeding the camera and then suddenly act offended when the camera bites back. Gabbard, to her credit or her strategy, didn't keep swinging wildly. She tightened it up, like someone who understood that the audience only needs a few clean beats, not a lifetime of grievances. She looked back to the chairman and asked for a simple thing: equal time, clear answers, the same standard applied to her and to the people questioning her. And that's where the hearing became uncomfortable for senators who prefer their power to feel invisible. Because the moment a nominee starts demanding symmetry, the senators have to choose between fairness and control. Schiff went for another line of defense, the moral one. He implied, carefully, without saying it outright, that it's dangerous to undermine public trust in intelligence agencies, especially at a time when foreign threats are real. That's a powerful argument, because it wraps the speaker in patriotism and makes the critic sound reckless. But Gabbard had built her whole persona around a counter-argument that's just as emotionally potent. Trust has already been undermined, and pretending otherwise is how you guarantee it never comes back. She framed it as reform, not revenge, and she framed her bluntness as discipline, not spectacle. You could feel certain senators shifting into a quieter panic, the kind you only notice if you've watched enough hearings. They weren't panicking because of any single point. They were panicking because the format was slipping out of their hands. Confirmation hearings are supposed to be one-way mirrors. The nominee is visible, the committee is the judge, and the public is the jury. If a nominee turns the mirror around, even for 10 minutes, the committee becomes visible in a way that can't be managed by staff memos. And visibility is what Washington fears most, because visibility makes motives look messy. The ranking Democrat tried to rescue Schiff without making it look like a rescue. He asked a question about Gabbard's past statements, her meetings overseas, her views on surveillance authorities, topics designed to pull the hearing back onto familiar tracks. Gabbard answered calmly, and she gave the kind of responses nominees are trained to give: respect for the law, commitment to oversight, support for intelligence collection within constitutional limits. But then she did something subtle that kept the tension alive. She kept looping back to the same theme, precision and accountability, like a refrain you couldn't unhear. Not a rant, not a sermon, just a steady reminder that the people in the room had asked Americans to trust them with enormous power. At one point, Schiff tried to reframe the conflict as personal, He suggested Gabbard was settling old scores, trying to relitigate the political wars of the last decade rather than talking about the job in front of her. That's a common accusation in Washington, and sometimes it's true, because everyone here is always relitigating something. But it didn't land cleanly because the public has watched Schiff relitigate Trump-related narratives for years, sometimes with a tone of certainty that didn't always age gracefully. In a fight over who's obsessed with the past, neither side has clean hands, and that's what makes it combustible. Then came the moment the committee didn't want to give Gabbard. A pause. A senator asked a question. She answered, and there was an awkward beat where nobody jumped in to break the rhythm. That beat mattered because it let viewers imagine what the committee members were thinking instead of just hearing what they were saying. Schiff looked less like a prosecutor and more like a man doing damage control for his own highlight reel. Gabbard looked less like a nominee and more like a cross-examiner who understood the power of letting silence do the accusing. If this were a real-world hearing, the next step would be predictable. They'd retreat into closed session. The committee would vote, staff would trade talking points, and senators would leave through side doors to avoid cameras asking the obvious questions. But in the political universe you're building, the closed session is where the real drama happens anyway, because that's where people say what they actually mean. Two Republican senators would lean in and tell Gabbard quietly that her approach was risky but effective, and that the base will love it. Two Democratic senators would tell Schiff quietly that he got blindsided and that the party can't afford another viral humiliation like this. Meanwhile, the press outside would be doing what press always does, hunting for the narrative that fits in a headline. Was it Gabbard clashes with Schiff? Or Gabbard hijacks hearing? Or Schiff confronted over past claims? Or Trump nominee turns tables on Democrats? Each of those versions is a different story, even if they describe the same footage. And the story that wins is the one that makes the audience feel like they've learned a secret. In American politics, secret doesn't mean classified. It means a moment where the mask slips. Schiff's comms team would push a line that sounds responsible. The nominee is politicizing intelligence, endangering trust, repeating partisan narratives. They'd say Gabbard is auditioning for a cable news circuit, rather than demonstrating the temperament required for the job. Gabbard's team would push a different line that also sounds responsible. The senator is dodging. The nominee is demanding accountability. The intelligence community needs reform and transparency. Both sides would pretend they're defending democracy, because that's how everyone sells their self-interest in Washington. And the public, exhausted and suspicious, would pick whichever story matches the frustration they already carry. The thing that makes this arc addictive is that it's not really about who's right. It's about who looks sturdy when the spotlight gets hot, who can answer directly, who can keep their composure when they're not in control. Schiff is used to control. He's used to being the one asking the questions, setting the frame, guiding the moral of the story. Gabbard's whole brand is built on refusing the frame, rejecting the script, insisting that the old rules are just old people protecting old power. So when they collide, it doesn't feel like a policy dispute. It feels like a referendum on how politics has been done for a long time. After the hearing, Schiff would likely do what seasoned politicians do: find a friendly camera and try to steady the narrative. He'd say something like, "This wasn't about me. It was about her fitness." And he'd try to treat the confrontation as a distraction. But here's the trap. The more you insist it's not about you, the more viewers suspect it is. Because viewers have learned the hard way that the people who say, "This is a distraction," are often the people who don't want to answer the question. And once an audience decides you're avoiding, even the most reasonable explanation sounds like spin. Gabbard, on the other hand, would keep her public posture almost boring. Short statement, no fireworks. I respect the committee. I answered every question. I will restore integrity and end politicization. That restraint would be strategic because her supporters already have the viral clips. They don't need her to oversell them. The more she acts like she's above the drama, the more the drama follows her like a shadow, making her look like the only adult in a room full of performers. It's not fair, maybe, but politics isn't a fairness contest. It's a perception contest. Then the real amplification begins, because American politics isn't decided in hearing rooms anymore. It's decided in living rooms watching edits. A 10-second clip becomes a 30-second montage. The montage becomes a 5-minute breakdown, the breakdown becomes an hour-long commentary, and the commentary becomes common knowledge. People who never read the reports will argue about what the reports obviously say. People who never watch the whole hearing will swear they know exactly what happened in context. And the politicians will pretend they hate the chaos while quietly benefiting from it, because outrage is the only thing that consistently sells. The next day, a handful of neutral-sounding analysts would go on TV and say some version of, "Both sides had points." That's the professional way to say, we don't want to get yelled at by either tribe. But the audience doesn't want both sides anymore, not in moments like this. They want a verdict, a hero, a villain, a clean ending, even if reality refuses to give them one. And that's why Schiff's situation becomes dangerous. Once a politician is cast as the symbol of something people resent, nuance doesn't save them. Inside the Senate, the calculation would turn cold and mathematical. Democrats would ask, is defending Schiff worth the cost, or do we quietly distance and move on? Republicans would ask, how do we keep the focus on Schiff long enough to cement the story into the next election cycle? Gabbard would ask, how do I keep the reform brand without looking like I'm settling scores for Trump? And Schiff would ask the question politicians hate asking themselves, what if this time my usual playbook doesn't work? Because here's what makes moments like this feel like a turning point, even when they aren't. Schiff built his authority on certainty, on the impression that he had access to facts the public couldn't see. That can be persuasive, especially when the public fears foreign interference and wants guardians who sound confident. But certainty is alone with interest. Eventually, you have to pay it back with proof, or people decide you were selling confidence as a substitute for evidence. And the second people decide that, they start rewatching everything you said with a different set of eyes. That's when old clips turn toxic, not because they prove guilt, but because they prove tone. Tone is what audiences punish when they feel manipulated. If you sounded absolutely sure back then, and now you sound careful and lawyerly, the audience assumes you were bluffing. If you sounded careful back then, and now you sound absolutely sure, the audience assumes you're rewriting history. Either way, the audience stops trusting the speaker, and once trust breaks, every future statement lands with half the weight. So the story doesn't end with a vote. It ends with a hangover. A hangover for Schiff, because the hearing created a new lens through which everything he's done will be judged. A hangover for Democrats, because their moral authority on protecting institutions looks shakier when institutions feel like instruments. A hangover for Republicans, because they're tempted to turn every grievance into a weapon, and weapons have a way of boomeranging. And a hangover for the country, because the more hearings look like trials, and the more trials look like theater, the harder it gets to remember what accountability is supposed to feel like.